On Disobedience by Erich Fromm. Chapter 3. Let Man Prevail. When the medieval world was torn wide open, Western man seemed to be headed for the final fulfillment of his keenest dreams and visions. He freed himself from the authority of a totalitarian church, the weight of traditional thought, the geographical limitations of a half-discovered globe. He discovered nature and the individual. He became aware of his own strength, of his capacity to make himself the ruler over nature and over traditionally given circumstances. He believed that he would be capable of achieving a synthesis between his newborn sense of strength and rationality and the spiritual values of his humanistic spiritual tradition, between the prophetic ideas of the messianic time of peace and justice to be achieved by mankind in the historical process, and the Greek tradition of theoretical thought. In the centuries following the Renaissance and the Reformation, he built a new science which eventually led to the release of hitherto unheard of productive powers and to the complete transformation of the material world. He created political systems which seemed to guarantee the free and productive development of the individual. He reduced the time of work to such an extent that Western man is free to enjoy hours of leisure to an extent his forefathers had hardly dreamed of. Yet where are we today? The world is divided into two camps, the capitalist and the communist camp. Both camps believe that they have the key to the fulfillment of human hopes of generations past. Both maintain that, while they must coexist, their systems are incompatible. Are they right? Are they not both in the process of converging into a new industrial neo-feudalism, into industrial societies, led and manipulated by big, powerful bureaucracies, societies in which the individual becomes a well-fed and well-entertained automaton who loses his individuality, his independence, and his humanity? Have we to resign ourselves to the fact that we can master nature and produce goods in an ever-increasing degree, but that we must give up hope for a world of solidarity and justice? That this ideal will be lost in an empty technological concept of progress? Is there no other alternative than that between capitalist and communist managerial industrialism? Can we not build an industrial society in which the individual retains his role as an active, responsible member who controls circumstances rather than be controlled by them? Are economic wealth and human fulfillment really incompatible? These two camps not only compete economically and politically, they are both set against each other in deadly fear of an atomic attack which will wipe out both, if not all, civilization. Indeed, man has created the atom bomb. It is the result of one of his greatest intellectual achievements, but he has lost the mastery over his own creation. The bomb has become his master. The forces of his own creation will become his most dangerous enemy. Is there still time to reverse this course? Can we succeed in changing it and becoming the masters of circumstances, rather than allowing circumstances to rule us? Can we overcome the deep-seated roots of barbarism, which make us try to solve the problems in the only way in which they can never be solved, by force, violence, and killing? Can we close the gap between our great intellectual achievement and our emotional and moral backwardness? In order to answer these questions, a more detailed examination of Western man's present position is necessary. To most Americans, the case for the success of our model of industrial organization seems to be clear and overwhelming. New productive forces, steam, electricity, oil, and atomic energy, and new forms of organization of work, central planning, bureaucratization, increased division of labor, and automation have created a material wealth in the most advanced industrial countries which has done away with the extreme poverty in which the majority of their populations lived 100 years ago. Working hours have been reduced from 70 to 40 hours per week in the last 100 years, and with increasing automation and ever shorter working day, And with increasing automation, an ever shorter working day may give man an undreamed of amount of leisure. Basic education has been brought to every child, higher education to a considerable percentage of the total population. Movies, radio, television, sports, and hobbies fill out the many hours in which man now has for his leisure. Indeed, it seems that for the first time in history, the vast majority, and soon all men, in the Western world will be primarily concerned with living rather than with the struggle to secure the material conditions for living. It seems that the fondest dreams of our forefathers are close to their realization, and that the Western world has found the answer to the question of what the good life is. While the majority of men in North America and Western Europe still share this outlook, there are an increasing number of thoughtful and sensitive persons who see the flaws in this enticing picture. They notice, first of all, that even within the richest country in the world, the USA, about 1/5 of the population does not share in the good life of the majority, that a considerable number of fellow citizens have not reached the material standard of living which is the basis for a dignified human existence. They are aware, furthermore, that more than 2/3 of the human race, those who for centuries were the object of Western colonialism, have a standard of living from 10 to 20 times lower than ours, and have a life expectancy half of that of the average American. They are struck by the irrational contradictions which beset our system. While there are millions in our own midst and hundreds of millions abroad who do not have enough to eat, we restrict agricultural production and in addition spend hundreds of millions each year in storing our surplus. We have affluence, but we do not have amenity. We are wealthier, but we have less freedom. We consume more, but we are emptier. We have more atomic weapons, but we are more defenseless. We have more education, but we have less critical judgment and convictions. We have more religion, but we are more we have more religion, but we are more materialistic. We speak of the American tradition, which, in fact, is the spiritual tradition of radical humanism, and we call un-American those who want to apply the tradition to the present-day society. However, even if we comfort ourselves, as many do, with the assumption that it is only a matter of a few generations until the West and eventually the whole world will have reached economic affluence, the question arises, what has become of man, and where is he going if we continue on the road our industrial system has taken? In order to understand how those elements by which our system succeeded in solving some of its economic problems are leading to an increasing failure to solve the human problem, it is necessary to examine the features which are characteristic of 20th century capitalism. Concentration of capital to the formation of giant enterprises, managed by hierarchically organized bureaucracies, large agglomerations of workers put together, part of a vast organized production machine which, in order to run at all, must run smoothly, without friction, without interruption. The individual worker and clerk becomes a cog in this machine. Their function and activities are determined by the whole structure of the organization in which they work. In the large enterprises, legal ownership of the means of production has become separated from the management and has lost importance. The big enterprises are run by bureaucratic management, which does not own the enterprise legally, but socially. These managers do not have the qualities of the old owner, individual initiative, daring, risk-taking, but the qualities of a bureaucrat, lack of individuality, impersonality, caution, lack of imagination. They administer things and persons, and relate to persons as to things. This managerial class, while it does not own the enterprise legally, controls it factually. It is responsible in an effective way, neither to the stockholders nor to those who work within the enterprise. In fact, while most of the important fields of production are in the hands of the large corporations, these corporations are practically ruled by their top employees. The giant corporations which control the economic and to a large degree the political destiny of the country constitute the very opposite of the democratic process. They represent power without control by those submitted to it. Aside from the industrial bureaucracy, the vast majority of the population is administered still by other bureaucracies. First of all, the governmental bureaucracy, including that of the armed forces, which influences and directs the lives of many millions in one form or another. More and more, the industrial, military, and governmental bureaucracies are becoming intertwined, both in their activities and increasingly in their personnel. With the development of ever greater enterprises, unions have also developed into big bureaucracy machines. With the development of ever greater enterprises, unions have also developed into big bureaucratic machines in which the individual member has very little to say. Many union chiefs are managerial bureaucrats, just as industrial chiefs are. All these bureaucracies have no plan and no vision. And due to the very nature of bureaucratic administration, this has to be so. When man is transformed into a thing and managed like a thing, his managers themselves become things, and things have no will, no vision, no plan. With the bureaucratic management of people, the democratic process becomes transformed into a ritual. Whether it is a stockholders' meeting of a big enterprise, a political election, or a union meeting, the individual has lost almost all influence to determine decisions and to participate effectively in the decision-making process. Especially in the political sphere, elections become more and more reduced to plebiscites, in which the individual can express preference for one of two slates of professional politicians, and the best that can be said is that he is governed with his consent. But the means to bring about this consent are those of suggestion and manipulation, and, with all that, the most fundamental decisions, those of foreign policy, which involve peace and war, are made by small groups which the average citizen hardly even knows. The political ideas of democracy, as the founding fathers of the United States conceived them, were not purely political ideas. They were rooted in the spiritual tradition which came to us from prophetic messianism, the Gospels, humanism, and from the Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century. All these ideas and movements were centered around one hope, that man, in the course of his history, can liberate himself from poverty, ignorance, and injustice, and that he can build a society of harmony, peace, and union between man, and between man and nature. The idea that history has a goal, and that the faith in man's perfectibility within the historical process have been the most specific elements of Occidental thought. They are the soil in which the American tradition is rooted, and from which it draws its strengths and vitality. What's happened to the idea of the perfectibility of man and of society? It has deteriorated into a flat concept of progress, into a vision of the production of more and better things, rather than the standing for the birth of the fully alive and productive man. Our political concepts have today lost their spiritual roots. They have become matters of expediency, judged by the criterion of whether they help us to a higher standard of living and to a more effective form of political administration. Having lost their roots in the hearts and longings of man, they have become empty shells to be thrown away if expediency warrants it. The individual is managed and manipulated not only in the sphere of production, but also in the sphere of consumption, which allegedly is the one in which the individual expresses his free choice. Whether it is the consumption of food, clothing, liquor, cigarettes, movies, or television programs, a powerful suggestion apparatus is employed with two purposes: First, to constantly increase the individual's appetite for new commodities, and second, to direct these appetites into the channels most profitable for industry. The very size of capital investment in the consumer goods industry and the competition between a few giant enterprises make it necessary not to leave consumption to chance, nor to leave the consumer a free choice of whether he wants to buy more or what he wants to buy. His appetites have to be constantly whetted. Tastes have to be manipulated, managed, and made predictable. Man is transformed into the consumer, the eternal suckling, whose one wish is to consume more and better things. While our economic system has enriched man materially, it has impoverished him humanly. Notwithstanding all propaganda and slogans about the Western world's faith in God, its idealism, its spiritual concern, our system has created a materialistic culture and a materialistic man. During his working hours, the individual is managed as part of a production team. During his hours of leisure time, he is managed and manipulated to be the perfect consumer who likes what he is told to like, and yet has the illusion that he follows his own tastes. All the time he is being hammered at by slogans, by suggestions, by voices of unreality which deprive him of his last bit of realism he may still have. From childhood on, true convictions are discouraged. There is little critical thought, there is little real feeling, and hence only conformity with the rest can save the individual from the unbearable feeling. There is little critical thought, there is little real feeling, and hence only conformity with the rest can save the individual from an unbearable feeling of loneliness and lostness. The individual does not experience himself as an active bearer of his own powers and inner richness, but as an impoverished thing, dependent on powers outside himself, into which he has projected his living substance. Man is alienated from himself, and bows down before the works of his own hands. He bows down before the things he produces, before the state, and before the leaders of his own making. His own acts become to him an alien power, standing over and against him, instead of being ruled by him. More than ever in history, the consolidation of our own product to an objective force above us, outgrowing our control, defeating our expectations, annihilating our calculations, is one of the main factors determining our development. His products, his machines, and the state have become the idols of modern man, and these idols represent his own life forces in alienated form. Indeed, Marx was right in recognizing that the place of all physical and mental senses has been taken by the self-alienation of all these senses, by the sense of having. Private property has made us so stupid and impotent that things become ours only if we have them, that is, if they exist for us as capital, and are owned by us, eaten by us, drunk by us, that is, used by us. We are poor in spite of all of our wealth because we have much, but we are little. As a result, the average man feels insecure, lonely, depressed, and suffers from the lack of joy in the midst of plenty. Life does not make sense to him. He is dimly aware that the meaning of life cannot lie in being nothing but a consumer. He could not stand the joylessness and meaninglessness of life were it not for the fact that the system offers him innumerable avenues of escape, ranging from television to tranquilizers, which permit him to forget that he's losing more and more of all that is valuable in life. In spite of all the slogans to the contrary, we are quickly approaching a society governed by bureaucrats who administer a mass man, well fed, well taken care of, dehumanized, and depressed. We produce machines that are like men, and men who are like machines. That which was the greatest criticism of socialism 50 years ago, that it would lead to uniformity, bureaucratization, centralization, and soulless materialism, is the reality of today's capitalism. We talk of freedom and democracy, yet an increasing number of people are afraid of the responsibility of freedom and prefer the slavery of the well-fed robot. They have no faith in democracy and are happy to leave it to the political experts to make decisions. We have created a widespread system of communication by means of radio, television, and newspapers, yet people are misinformed and indoctrinated rather than informed about political and social reality. In fact, there is a degree of uniformity in our opinions and ideas which could be explained without difficulty if it were the result of political pressure and caused by fear. The fact is that all agree voluntarily, in spite of the fact that our systems rest exactly on the idea of the right to disagreement and the predilection for diversity of ideas. Double talk has become the rule in the free enterprise countries as well as amongst their opponents. The latter call dictatorship people's democracies, the former call dictatorships freedom-loving people if they are political allies. Of the possibility of 50 million Americans being killed in an atomic attack, one speaks of the hazards of war, and one talks of victory in a showdown, when sane thinking makes it clear that there can be no victory for anyone in an atomic holocaust. Education, from primary to higher education, has reached its peak. Yet while people get more education, they have less reason, judgment, and conviction. At best, their intelligence is improved, but their reason, that is, their capacity to penetrate through the surface and to understand the underlying forces in individual and social life, is impoverished more and more. Thinking is increasingly split from feeling, and the very fact that people tolerate the threat of an atomic war hovering over all mankind shows that modern man has come to a point where his sanity must be questioned. Man, instead of being the master of the machines he has built, has become their servant. But man is not made to be a thing, and with all the satisfactions of consumption, the life forces in man cannot be held in abeyance continuously. We have only one choice, that is the mastering of the machine again, making production into a means and not an end, using it for the unfolding of man, or else the suppressed life energies will manifest themselves into chaotic and destructive forms. Man will want to destroy life rather than die of boredom. Can we make our mode of social and economic organisation responsible for this state of man? As was indicated above, our industrial system, its way of production and consumption, the relation between human beings which it fosters, creates precisely the human situation which has been described, not because it wants to create it, not due to evil intentions of individuals, but because of the fact that the average man's character is formed by the practice of life, which is provided by the structure of society. No doubt the form which capitalism has taken in the 20th century is very different from what it was in the 19th century. So different, in fact, that it is doubtful whether even the same term should be applied to both systems. The enormous concentration of capital in giant enterprises, the increasing separation of management from ownership, the existence of powerful trade unions, state subsidies for agriculture, and for some parts of industry, the elements of the welfare system, elements of price control and directed market, and many more features radically distinguish 20th century capitalism from that of the past. Yet, whatever terminology we choose, certain basic elements are common to the old and the new capitalism. The principle that not solidarity and love, but individualistic, egotistical action brings about the best result for everyone. The belief that an impersonal mechanism, the market, should regulate the life of society, not the will, vision, and planning of people. Capitalism puts things, capital, higher than that of life, labour. Power flows from possession, not from activity. Contemporary capitalism creates additional obstacles for the unfolding of man. It needs smoothly working teams of workers, clerks, engineers, consumers. It needs them because big enterprises, led by bureaucracies, require this kind of organisation and the organisation man who fits into it. Our system must create people who fit its needs. It must create people who cooperate smoothly and in large numbers. People who want to consume more and more. People whose tastes are standardized and can be easily anticipated and influenced. It needs people who feel free and independent, not subject to any authority or principle of conscience, yet who are willing to be commanded to do what is expected of them, to fit into the social machine without friction. It needs people who can be guided without force, led without leaders, prompted without aim, except the aim to make good, and to be on the move, to go ahead. Production is guided by the principle that capital investment must bring profit, rather than the principle that the real needs of people determine what is to be produced. Since everything, including radio, television, books and medicines, is subjected to the profit principle, the people are manipulated into the kind of consumption which is often poisonous for the spirit and sometimes also for the body. The failure of our society to fulfill the human aspirations rooted in our spiritual traditions has immediate consequences for the two most burning practical issues of our time, that of peace and that of the equalization between the wealth of the West and the poverty of 2/3 of mankind. The alienation of modern man, with all its consequences, make it difficult for him to solve these problems, because of the fact that he worships things and has lost the reverence for life, his own and that of fellow men. He is blind not only to moral principles, but also to rational thought in the interests of his survival. It is clear that atomic armament is likely to lead to universal destruction, and even if atomic war could be prevented, that it will lead to a climate of fear, suspicion, and regimentation, which is exactly the climate in which freedom and democracy cannot live. It is clear that the economic gap between poor and rich nations will lead to violent explosions and dictatorships. Yet nothing but the most half-hearted and hence futile attempts are suggested to solve these problems. Indeed, it seems that we are going to prove that the gods blind those whom they want to destroy. Thus far goes the record of capitalism. What is the record of socialism? What did it intend and what did it achieve in those countries in which it has had a chance of being realised? Socialism in the 19th century, in the Marxian form and in its many other forms, wanted to create the material basis for a dignified human existence for everyone. It wanted work to direct capital rather than capital to direct work. For socialism, work and capital were not just two economic categories, but rather they represented two principles. Capital, the principle of amassed things, of having, and work, that of life and man's powers, of being and becoming. Socialists found that in capitalism's things directed life, that having is superior to being, that past directs the present, and they wanted to reverse this relation. The aim of socialism was man's emancipation, his restoration to the unalienated, uncrippled individual who enters into a new, rich, spontaneous relationship with his fellow man and with nature. The aim of socialism was that man should throw away the chains which bind him, the fictions and unrealities, and transform himself into a being who can make creative use of his powers of feeling and of thinking. Socialism wanted man to become independent, that is, to stand on his own feet, and believe that man can stand on his feet only if he owes his existence to himself, if he affirms his individuality as a total man in each of his relations to the world, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking, willing, loving. In short, if he affirms and expresses all organs of his individuality. The aim of socialism was the union between man, and between man and nature. quite in contrast to the frequently uttered cliche that Marx and other socialists taught that the desire for maximal material gain was the most fundamental human drive. These socialists believed that it is the very structure of capitalist society which makes material interests the deepest motive, and that socialism would permit non-material motives to assert themselves and free man from his servitude to material interests. It is a sad commentary on man's capacity for inconsistency that people condemned socialism for its alleged materialism, and at the same time criticise it with the argument that only the profit motive can motivate man to do his best. The aim of socialism was individuality, not uniformity. Liberation from economic bonds, not making material aims the main concern of life. The experience of full solidarity of all men, not the manipulation and domination of one man by another. The principle of socialism was that each man is an end in himself and must never be the means of another man. Socialists wanted to create a society in which each citizen actively and responsibly participated in all decisions, and in which a citizen could participate because he was a person and not a thing, because he had convictions and not synthetic opinions. For socialism, not only is poverty a vice, but also wealth. Material poverty deprives man of the basis for a humanly rich life. Material wealth, like power, corrupts man. It destroys the sense of proportion and the limitations which are inherent in human existence. It creates an unrealistic and almost crazy sense of the uniqueness of an individual, making him feel that he is not subject to the same basic conditions of existence as his fellow man. Socialism wants material comfort to be used for the true aims of living. It rejects individual wealth as a danger to society as well as to the individual. In fact, its opposition to capitalism is related to this very principle. By its very logic, capitalism aims at an ever-increasing material wealth, while socialism aims at an ever-increasing human productivity, aliveness, and happiness, and at material comfort only to the extent to which it is conducive to human aims. Socialism hoped for the eventual abolition of the state so that only things, and not people, would be administered. It aimed at a classless society in which freedom and initiative would be restored to the individual. Socialism in the 19th century and until the beginning of the First World War was the most significant humanistic and spiritual movement in Europe and America. What happened to socialism? It succumbed to the spirit of capitalism in which it had wanted to replace. Instead of understanding it as a movement for the liberation of man, which many of its adherents and its enemies alike understood it as being exclusively a movement for the economic improvement of the working class, the humanistic aims of socialism were forgotten, or only paid lip service to, while, as in capitalism, all the emphasis was laid on the aims of economic gain. Just as the ideals of democracy lost their spiritual roots, the idea of socialism lost its deepest root, the prophetic messianic faith in peace, justice, and the brotherhood of man. Thus, socialism became the vehicle for the workers to attain their place within the capitalist structure, rather than transcending it. Instead of changing capitalism, socialism was absorbed by its spirit. The failure of the socialist movement became complete when in 1914 its leaders renounced international solidarity and chose the economic and military interests of their respective countries as against the ideas of internationalism and peace which had been their programme. The misinterpretation of socialism as a purely economic movement and of nationalisation of the means of production as its principal aim occurred both in the right wing and left wing of the socialist movement. The reformist leaders of the socialist movement in Europe considered it their primary aim to elevate the economic status of the worker within the capitalist system, and they considered as their most radical measures the nationalisation of certain big industries. Only recently have many realized that the nationalization of an enterprise is in itself not the realization of socialism, that to be managed by a publicly appointed bureaucracy is not basically different for the worker than being managed by a privately appointed bureaucracy. The leaders of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union interpreted socialism in the same purely economic way. But living in a country much less developed than Western Europe and without a democratic tradition, they applied terror and dictatorship to enforce the rapid accumulation of capital which in Western Europe had occurred in the 19th century. They developed a new form of state capitalism which proved to be economically successful and humanly destructive. They built a bureaucratically managed society in which class distinction, both in an economic sense and as far as the power of command to others is concerned, is deeper and more rigid than in any of the capitalist societies today. They define their system as socialistic because they have nationalized the whole economy, while in reality their system is the complete negation of all that socialism stands for, the affirmation of individuality and the full development of man. In order to win the support of the masses, who had to make unendurable sacrifices for the sake of the fast accumulation of capital, they used socialistic, combined with nationalistic ideologies, and this granted them the grudging cooperation of those governed. Thus far, the free enterprise system is superior to the communist system because it has preserved one of the greatest achievements of modern man, political freedom, and with it a respect for the dignity and individuality of man, which links us to the fundamental spiritual tradition of humanism. It permits possibilities of criticism and of making proposals for constructive social change which are practically impossible in the Soviet police state. It is to be expected, however, that once the Soviet countries have achieved the same level of economic development as Western Europe and the United States have achieved, that is, once they can satisfy the demand for a comfortable life, they will not need terror, but will be able to use the same means of manipulation which are used in the West: suggestion and persuasion. This development will bring about the convergence of 20th century capitalism and 20th century communism. Both systems are based on industrialization. Their goal is ever increasing economic efficiency and wealth. They are societies run by a managerial class and by professional politicians. They are both thoroughly materialistic in their outlook, regardless of lip service to Christian ideology in the West and secular messianism in the East. They organize the masses in a centralized system, in large factories, in political mass parties. In both systems, if they go on in the same way, the mass man, the alienated man, a well-fed, well-clothed, well-entertained automaton, man governed by bureaucrats who have as little a goal as the mass man has, will replace the creative, thinking, feeling man. Things will have the first place, and man will be dead. He will talk of freedom and individuality, while he will be nothing. Where do we stand today? Capitalism and a vulgarized, distorted socialism has brought man to the point where he is in danger of becoming a dehumanized automaton. He is losing his sanity and stands at the point of total self-destruction. Only full awareness of his situation and its dangers, and a new vision of life which can realize the aims of human freedom, dignity, creativity, reason, justice, and solidarity, can save us from an almost certain decay, loss of freedom, or destruction. We are not forced to choose between a managerial free enterprise system and a managerial communist system. There is a third solution, that of democratic, humanistic socialism, which, based on the original principles of socialism, offers the vision of a new, truly human society.